London's glittering Marlow Theatre, 1930s. A star is born in Clara Vane, but her radiant light is snuffed out in her dressing room. A crimson scarf, her silent killer. Enter Miss Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind unraveling. A web of envy and ambition. The suspects, a domineering director, a charming co-star, a calculating agent, and a flamboyant stylist. As whispers in the wings reveal secrets, one truth emerges. Jealousy can turn the brightest stage dark. Will Miss Marple catch the killer before the curtain falls forever? Chapter 1. The glitter of the stage. The Marlow Theatre stood like a gilded beacon in the heart of London's West End, its marquee ablaze with golden letters spelling out a star ascends. The air buzzed with anticipation as the fashionable crowd poured through its velvet-draped doors, their laughter and chatter mingling with the faint hum of the city beyond. Miss Jane Marple, perched primly in a balcony seat, adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the scene with her usual quiet curiosity. Her nephew, Raymond West, a writer with a flair for the dramatic, had insisted she attend the play, declaring it the theatrical triumph of the season. Miss Marple, though no stranger to London's bustle, preferred the gentle rhythms of St. Mary Mead, but Raymond's enthusiasm had persuaded her to venture out. Below, the auditorium sparkled with the elegance of the evening ladies in shimmering gowns, gentlemen in crisp evening dress, and the occasional flash of a jeweled tiara catching the chandelier's light. Miss Marple's keen eyes, however, were drawn not to the finery but to the faces, the eager anticipation of the young, the studied boredom of the critics, and the restless energy of those who seemed to know the cast personally. She noted a woman in a fox-fur stole whispering urgently to her companion, and a young man in the stalls fidgeting with his program, his eyes darting toward the stage. People, she thought, were always so revealing when they believed themselves. Unobserved, the house lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd as the curtain rose. The play was a confection of romance and ambition, set in a world of glittering ballrooms and whispered betrayals. At its heart was Clara Vane, a young actress, whose luminous presence seemed to draw every eye. Her voice, clear and emotive, carried effortlessly to the rafters, and her delicate features framed by auburn curls held a haunting vulnerability. Miss Marple, though no expert in the theatre, recognized the rare magic of a true star. Clara's performance as the ingenue, rising from obscurity to fame, was met with rapturous applause at the interval, and Miss Marple found herself nodding approvingly. Quite remarkable, she murmured to herself, thinking of young Elsie Carter in her village, whose quiet grace had once turned heads at the church Ft. As the final act drew to a close, the audience erupted in a standing ovation, the theatre ringing with cheers. Miss Marple clapped politely, her mind already turning to the cup of tea she hoped to enjoy at her hotel. But as she made her way down the grand marble staircase, a ripple of unease passed through the departing crowd. Whispers spread like wildfire. Something was amiss backstage. A young usher, his face pale, was seen hurrying toward the manager's office. Miss Marple paused, her gloved hand resting lightly on the banister, and listened. Clara Vane. A woman in a velvet hat hissed to her companion. Found dead, they say, in her dressing room. The words sent a chill through Miss Marple, not for their sensationalism, but for their finality. She had seen death before, in the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead and beyond, and she knew its shadow often hid darker truths. She lingered in the foyer, her small figure almost lost among the departing theatregoers, until a familiar voice called her name. Inspector Craddock, his face grim beneath his trilby, approached with a respectful nod. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his tone betraying the weight of the moment. "I'm afraid we have a situation. Would you care to step backstage?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression remained composed. "If I can be of any help, Inspector," she replied, following him through a side door, into the labyrinthine corridors of the theatre. The glamour of the auditorium gave way to a world of bare walls and cluttered props, where stagehands whispered nervously and a faint scent of grease paint hung in the air. They reached Clara's dressing room, its door ajar, guarded by a young constable who looked distinctly out of his depth. Inside, the scene was one of tragic disarray. Clara Vane lay slumped before her vanity mirror, her auburn curls spilling over her shoulders, her face pale and still. A silk scarf, vibrant crimson, was knotted tightly around her throat, its ends trailing across the cluttered table. Cosmetics and costume jewelry were scattered about. A half-empty teacup sat precariously near the edge, and a bouquet of roses wilted in a vase. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, noting the open wardrobe, the scattered scripts, and the faint smudge of powder on the mirror's edge. "Smothered," Craddock said quietly, and no sign of a struggle. "The door was unlocked, and we've for people who were seen nearby tonight." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already at work. "Mr. Drake, the director, I presume?" she asked, recalling the program's notes. "And Mr. Lane, her co-star? Miss Harper, her agent, perhaps? And a stylist, Mr. Morrow," Craddock confirmed with a wry smile. "You've a sharp memory, Miss Marple. Yes, those are our suspects for now." She tilted her head, her thoughts drifting to the village postmistress, Miss Weatherby, whose knack for noticing details had once unravelled a local scandal. "People are so often not what they seem," she said softly, her eyes lingering on the scarf. "I wonder what Clara knew that made her dangerous." As Craddock briefed his men, Miss Marple stepped closer to the vanity, her gaze falling on a small photograph tucked into the mirror's frame. It showed Clara and Victor Lane, arms linked, smiling for the camera. The image was bright, but something in Victor's expression, a tightness around the eyes, caught her attention. She filed it away, like a stitch in her knitting, and turned. To Craddock, "I shall return tomorrow, Inspector," she said. "Theatre people, like villagers, have their secrets, and secrets, you know, have a way of coming to light." Chapter 2. A scene of tragedy. The Marlow Theatre, so vibrant with applause only hours before, now lay under a pall of unease. The glittering crowds had dispersed, leaving behind a hushed stillness broken only by the occasional creak of the old building and the low murmur of police constables stationed at the entrances. Miss Jane Marple, her small figure wrapped in a sensible woolen coat, followed Inspector Craddock through the dimly lit corridors that wound behind the stage. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and stale perfume, and the walls, lined with faded posters of past productions, seemed to whisper of forgotten dramas. Miss Marple's steps were measured, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles, taking in every detail of this unfamiliar world that felt in its way, not so different from the quiet intrigues of St. Mary Mead. Inspector Craddock, his face drawn with the fatigue of a long night, led her to the door of Clara Vane's dressing room. The young constable guarding it stepped aside, his expression a mixture of nerves and awe at the presence of the unassuming elderly lady who seemed to command the inspector's respect. "It's a grim business," Miss Marple, Craddock said, pushing the door open. "We've kept everything as it was found, save for the body, which has been taken for examination. Smothered, the doctor says lightly, with that scarf. No sign of a fight, which is peculiar. The dressing room was a small, cluttered space, its walls papered in a faded floral pattern that clashed with the modern chaos within. A vanity table dominated one side, its surface strewn with pots of cold cream, lipsticks, and a scattering of hairpins. A cracked mirror, framed with bare light bulbs, reflected the disarray. To the left stood a wardrobe, its door ajar, revealing a cascade of costume silks and satins in jewel tones that spoke of Clara's starring role. A chaise lounge, upholstered in worn velvet, occupied the far corner, and beside it, a small table held a teapot, a single cup, and a saucer with a half-eaten biscuit. The crimson silk scarf, now in police custody, had been found knotted around Clara's throat, its vibrant hue a stark contrast to the pallor of her lifeless face. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the spot where Clara had been found, slumped before the vanity, as if caught in the act of preparing for her next scene. "Poor child," Miss Marple murmured, her voice soft but steady, "to be taken so young and in such a place." She stepped closer to the vanity, her gloved fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table. A faint smudge of face powder dusted the mirror surface, and a single rose petal, fallen from the bouquet in a nearby vase, lay curled on the floor. She noted the photograph tucked into the mirror's frame, the same one she had seen earlier. Clara and Victor Lane, their smiles bright but somehow strained. "No struggle, you say?" she asked, turning to Craddock. "None that we can see," he replied, rubbing his chin. "The doctor's preliminary report suggests she was taken by surprise. The scarf was tightened quickly, efficiently. Even whoever did this knew what they were about." He gestured to the room. "The door was unlocked, and the corridor outside is a busy one during a performance. 4 people were seen nearby around the time of death, between the final curtain and the discovery of the body. Lionel Drake, the director; Victor Lane, her co-star; Evelyn Harper, her agent; and Felix Moreau, her stylist." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the names: a director, a co-star, an agent, and a stylist. She mused, each with their own part to play in Clara's world, and each, perhaps, with their own reasons to wish her harm. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's tales of village rivalries, where envy and ambition often simmered beneath polite smiles. The theatre, she suspected, was no different, only its stage was grander, its passions more pronounced. Craddock handed her a notebook, its pages filled with neat official script. "We've taken statements, but they're thin so far. Drake says he was in the lighting booth, tweaking cues until the curtain fell. Lane claims he was at the stage door, signing autographs for fans. Harper was in her office, on the telephone, with some producer or other. And Moreau says he was backstage, steaming costumes for tomorrow's show. All have alibis, but none are airtight." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Alibis, Inspector, are like the lace doilies in my parlour, pretty to look at, but often full of holes." She stepped toward the wardrobe, peering at the array of costumes. A feathered headdress hung askew, and a pair of satin gloves lay discarded on the floor. "This scarf," she said, "the one used to end her life, was it Clara's?" "We believe so," Craddock said. "It matches the ones used in the player prop, designed by Moreau. There are dozens like it in the costume department, but this one was found here, in her room." He pointed to a hook on the wall, where a similar scarf, in emerald green, hung untouched. It's possible the killer grabbed it on impulse, or brought it deliberately, Miss Marple countered, her tone gentle but firm. She thought of Mrs. Pike, the St. Mary Mead dressmaker, who could tell a woman's secrets by the state of her hems. A scarf is such an intimate thing, don't you think? To use it so cruelly suggests familiarity, perhaps, or anger. She turned back to the vanity, her eyes falling on the teacup. Was this tested? Craddock nodded. Just tea, as far as we know. The biscuit, too, nothing unusual. The doctor will confirm, but there's no sign of poison or sedation. It's as if she sat down, unsuspecting, and then he trailed off, his expression darkening. Miss Marple moved to the chaise lounge, her fingers brushing the velvet. She was comfortable here, she said, almost to herself. This was her sanctuary, where she became the star. Yet someone entered, unopposed, and turned it into a tomb. She glanced at Craddock, who found her. A stagehand, young lad named Tommy Gibbs, Craddock replied. He was fetching a prop from the corridor and noticed the door ajar. Thought it odd, peeked in, and saw her. Poor boy's shaken, says he ran straight for the manager. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And this Tommy Gibbs did. He see anyone else in the corridor? He mentioned a few figures, but it's a busy place after a show. Stagehands, actors, cruel milling about. He couldn't be certain who was where. Craddock sighed. We're questioning everyone, but it's a maze of stories. A maze, indeed, Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft. She stepped to the window, which overlooked a narrow alley behind the theatre. The glass was smudged, and the latch was loose, but it was too small for entry or exit. No one came through here, she murmured, more to herself than to Craddock. The answer lies in the people, not the place. She turned back to the room, her gaze sweeping over the details once more, the scattered hairpins, the wilted roses, the photograph of Clara and Victor. Something about the image nagged at her, a flicker of tension in Clara's smile. Perhaps, or the way Victor's hand rested on her shoulder, almost possessive. She filed it away, like a stitch in her knitting, to be revisited later. Tell me about these four, she said, settling onto the chaise lounge with the air of one preparing for a long chat. What manner of people are they? Craddock flipped open his notebook. Lionel Drake, 42, the director. Bit of a taskmaster, by all accounts, but brilliant. They say he discovered Clara, plucked her from obscurity for this role. Some whisper he was too fond of her, though. There's no evidence of anything improper. Victor Lane, 30, the co-star. Charming fellow, popular with the ladies, but there's talk he resented Clara stealing the spotlight. Evelyn Harper, late 30s, her agent. Sharp as a tack, handles. All the big names. She stood to make a fortune off Clara's success. And Felix Moreau, 28, the stylist. A flamboyant sort, French, or so he claims. He designed Clara's costumes, doted on her like she was his masterpiece. Miss Marple listened, her hands folded neatly in her lap. A director who saw her as his creation, a co-star who envied her light, an agent who profited from her fame, and a stylist who worshipped her image, she said, each bound to her, yet each with a reason to resent her. She thought of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Price, whose devotion to her choir often masked a fierce protectiveness. People cling so tightly to what they love, she added softly, and sometimes that love turns to something darker. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You think this was personal, then? Oh, my dear Inspector, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling faintly. Murder is always personal, even when it pretends to be otherwise. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I should like to speak with these four, if I may. Tomorrow, perhaps, when the shock has settled and their guards are less rehearsed. Craddock nodded. Accustomed to her unorthodox methods, I'll arrange it. The theatre's closed for now, but they'll all be about, answering questions. You're staying at the Langham, I take it? Yes, Miss Marple replied, though I confess, these London hotels are rather too grand for my taste. Give me a quiet evening in St. Mary Mead, with a fire and my knitting, any day. She paused at the door, her gaze lingering on the vanity. One last thing, Inspector. The photograph, may I borrow it? Craddock hesitated, then nodded. I'll have it sent to you once we've documented it. Anything particular about it? Miss Marple smiled enigmatically. Only that it tells a story, Inspector. And stories, you know, are where the truth so often hides. As they left the dressing room, the constable resumed his post, and the corridors seemed to close in around them, its shadows heavy with secrets. Miss Marple walked slowly, her mind turning over the fragments she had gathered, the scarf, the teacup, the photograph, the unlocked door. She thought of Clara Vane, a girl who had risen from nowhere to dazzle the world, only to be snuffed out in her prime. And she thought of the four who had orbited her star-rich with their own desires, their own grievances. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen such patterns before. The jealous lover, the ambitious rival, the betrayed confidant. The theatre was merely a larger stage, but the human heart, she knew, played the same old roles. Outside, the night air was sharp, and the lights of the West End glittered like a false promise. Miss Marple pulled her coat tighter and made her way toward her hotel, her thoughts as precise and intricate as the lace she so often knitted. Tomorrow she would begin to unravel the threads of this tragedy, and she suspected that somewhere, in the tangle of lies and half-truths, she would find the one that led to Clara's killer. Chapter 3. The Director's Ambition. The morning after Clara Vane's death. The Marlow Theatre stood silent, its grandeur muted under a grey London sky. Miss Jane Marple arrived promptly at 10, her umbrella tucked under one arm, her sensible hat firmly in place despite the drizzle. The theatre's stage door, usually bustling with actors and crew, was guarded by a solitary constable who nodded her through with a deferential tip of his helmet. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of old wood and wax polish, and the corridors echoed with an unnatural stillness. Miss Marple made her way to the manager's office, where Inspector Craddock had arranged for her to meet Lionel Drake, the director of A Star Ascends. She settled into a leather armchair, her knitting bag at her feet, and waited, her eyes taking in the cluttered desk strewn with playbills and a half-empty bottle of brandy. Lionel Drake entered with a flourish, his thin frame draped in a tailored suit that seemed to protest his restless energy. His hair, greying at the temples, was swept back dramatically, and his eyes, sharp and dark, darted about the room before settling on Miss Marple. You must be the Lady Craddock mentioned, he said, his voice carrying the resonance of one accustomed to commanding a stage. I'm told you have a knack for sorting things out. Miss Marple inclined her head, her smile mild. I am merely an observer, Mr. Drake. I find that people often reveal more than they intend if one listens carefully. She gestured to the chair opposite. Do sit down. I should like to hear about Clara Vane and your part in her story. Drake sat, his fingers drumming a staccato rhythm on the armrest. Clara was a revelation, he began, his tone fervent. I found her in a provincial theatre in Bristol, playing a bit part in a dreadful comedy. She had a light, you see, a quality that couldn't be taught. I brought her to London, gave her the lead in A Star Ascends. It was my vision, but she made it soar. His voice cracked slightly, and he looked away, toward a framed poster of the play on the wall. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she began to knit, the rhythm steady and unobtrusive. A great responsibility to shape a young talent, she said. It must have been trying at times. Young people can be so unpredictable. She thought of young Gerald in St. Mary Mead, whose dreams of greatness often outstripped his patience. Drake's lips tightened. Clara was headstrong, I'll grant you that. She had ideas about the play, wanted changes to her role, more speeches, more drama. I told her the script was perfect as it was, but she'd argue, always with that charming smile. Still, she was worth the trouble. The audiences adored her, and you? Miss Marple asked gently, her eyes meeting his. Did you adore her? Too, Drake flushed, his fingers stilling. I admired her talent, he said sharply. Anything more would have been unprofessional. I'm a married man, Miss Marple, and my work is my life. Clara was my creation, nothing more. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. I was in the lighting booth last night, adjusting cues until the curtain fell. Ask anyone, my assistant. Mr. Hargreaves was with me. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Of course. And yet, I understand you argued with Clara recently. Something about extending the play's run. She recalled a snippet from the stagehand's gossip overheard the previous night. Drake's eyes narrowed. Who told you that? Yes, we had. Words Clara wanted to leave after the season. Said she'd had offers from film producers. I told her it was madness to abandon a hit, but she wouldn't listen. She thought she was bigger than the play. He shook his head, a bitter edge too. His voice, she was wrong. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. A pity, she said softly. Ambition can be such a double-edged sword. She thought of Mr. Clements, the village baker, whose drive to expand his shop had led to reckless debts. Did her decision anger you, Mr. Drake? Anger, he laughed, a sharp, theatrical sound. I was frustrated, yes, but I don't strangle my stars over artistic differences. I had plans for a new production, with or without Clara. He stood, pacing to the window. This play was my triumph, Miss Marple her death. It's a catastrophe, for me and for the theatre. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his hands clenched as he spoke of the play's future. His passion for his work was evident, but so was his need for control. She recalled the photograph of Clara and Victor, the tension in there, smiles. You worked closely with Mr. Lane, too, I presume? She asked, her tone conversational. He must have been affected by Clara's success. Drake snorted. Victor's a peacock, strutting for the spotlight. He didn't like playing second fiddle, but he hasn't the depth to carry a lead. Clara outshone him, and he knew it. He turned back to her, his expression softening. You're looking for motive, aren't you? Well, I had none. Clara was my star, my legacy. Without her, the play's future is uncertain. Miss Marple folded her knitting and placed it in her bag. Thank you, Mr. Drake. You've been most helpful. She rose, her small frame dwarfed by the room's grandeur. One last thing did. You notice anything unusual about Clara last night? A mood, perhaps, or a visitor? Drake hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the door. She was distracted, perhaps. Kept checking her watch during the interval, as if expecting someone. I thought it was nerves. She was always a bundle of energy before a show. He shrugged. I didn't press her. I had my own work to do. Miss Marple nodded, filing away. The detail. People are so often distracted by what matters most, she said, almost to herself. She thanked him again and stepped into the corridor, where Craddock was waiting. Well, he asked, his notebook at the ready. A passionate man, Miss Marple said, her voice low. And passion, Inspector, can be a dangerous thing when it's thwarted. She thought of Mrs. Harrow, whose love for her garden had once led to a bitter feud over a prize rose. Mr. Drake's alibi depends on his assistant, you say? Yes, Hargreaves, Craddock confirmed. He backs Drake's story, but he's a nervous sort, kept contradicting himself about the exact times. We're checking further. Good, Miss Marple said. And I should like to see this lighting booth, if I may. It sounds a most illuminating place. Her eyes twinkled, and Craddock suppressed a smile. They climbed a narrow staircase to the booth, a cramped space overlooking the stage, filled with levers and dials. The view was commanding, but Miss Marple noted the side door leading to the backstage corridors. A busy spot, she remarked, but not so busy that one couldn't slip away for a moment. She peered down at the stage, imagining Clara's final bow, the applause washing over her. Mr. Drake's world revolves around this theatre, she said. If Clara threatened that world, who knows what he might have done? Craddock raised an eyebrow. You think he's our man? Miss Marple shook her head. I think, Inspector, that we have only begun to see the players in this drama. Mr. Drake is ambitious, but ambition alone does not a murderer make. We must look deeper into the hearts of those who shared Clara's stage. She turned toward the door. Shall we speak to Mr. Lane next? I suspect he has a story of his own to tell. As they descended the stairs, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, weaving together the threads of Drake's words, his quick glances, his fierce pride. She thought of the village hall in St. Mary Mead, where amateur theatricals had once revealed hidden jealousies. The Marlowe Theatre was grander, but its secrets, she suspected, were no less human. Chapter 4. The co-stars charmed. The Marlowe Theatre's backstage corridors, so quiet in the morning light, seemed to hold their breath as Miss Jane Marple followed Inspector Craddock toward Victor Lane's dressing room. The walls, lined with faded call sheets and scribbled notes, bore witness to countless performances, and Miss Marple felt the weight of their stories as she walked. Her sensible shoes tapped softly on the worn floorboards, and her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing, not the scuff marks near a stage exit, nor the faint trace of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Victor Lane, the co-star of A Star Ascends, awaited them, and Miss Marple was eager to take his measure. The dressing-room door bore a brass nameplate with Victor's name, polished to a gleam that suggested pride, if not vanity. Craddock knocked, and a voice, smooth and resonant, called, "Come in." Inside, Victor Lane stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of a silk shirt with practiced ease. He was a strikingly handsome man, with dark hair swept back and eyes that sparkled with a calculated charm. The room was a shrine to his image. Photographs of himself in various roles adorned the walls, and a vase of fresh lilacent, no doubt by an admirer, sat on a polished side table. A script lay open on the dressing table, its margins filled with bold, confident annotations. "Inspector Craddock," Victor said, turning with a smile that seemed to light the room, and his gaze fell on Miss Marple, and his eyebrows lifted slightly, as if surprised to find an elderly lady in such a setting. "Miss Marple," she introduced herself, her tone mild but firm. "I'm assisting the inspector with a few inquiries. I hope we're not interrupting." "Not at all," Victor replied, gesturing to a pair of chairs with a flourish. "Though I must say, this is a grim business. Clara was a dear friend." His voice softened, but Miss Marple noted the careful pause, as if he were choosing his words for an audience. She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, and studied him. He reminded her of young Mr. Sanders in St. Mary Mead, whose easy charm had won hearts but often masked a restless ambition. "You and Clara must have spent much time together," she said, her needles clicking softly as she began to knit. "On stage and off, I imagine." Victor leaned against the dressing table, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. "We did," he admitted. "The play demanded it hours of rehearsals, publicity events, interviews. Clara was magnetic. The audiences couldn't get enough of her." He smiled faintly, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of something darker in his expression, envy, perhaps, or resentment. "It must be difficult," she said gently, "to share the stage with someone so luminous. I've heard she was the heart of the production." Victor's smile tightened. "She was talented, no question, but the play was a team effort." "I held my own, Miss Marple. The review said as much." He gestured to a framed clipping on the wall, praising his dynamic presence. Yet Miss Marple noticed another clipping, half hidden behind it, that lauded Clara as a star reborn. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "And last night, after the performance, where were you when the curtain fell?" "At the stage door," Victor answered promptly, "signing autographs, posing for photographs. The fans were out in force Clara's doing, mostly, but I've my own following." He flashed a grin, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn too. A faint scratch on his wrist, just visible beneath his cuff. It was fresh, the skin slightly reddened, and she made a mental note, recalling how Mrs. Finch's son in the village had once tried to hide a mark from a scuffle. "You didn't visit Clara's dressing room?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a vicar's wife discussing parish matters. Victor shook his head, a touch too quickly. "No need. I saw her during the interval. Of course we had a quick word about the final scene. But after the show, I was swamped with admirers." He chuckled, but the sound lacked warmth. Miss Marple nodded, her needles never pausing. "And how did Clara seem during the interval?" "In good spirits." Victor hesitated, his fingers brushing the script on the table. "She was herself. A bit distracted, perhaps. Kept glancing at her dressing room door, as if expecting someone. I teased her about it, said she must have a secret suitor." She laughed, but he trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "It was nothing, I'm sure." Miss Marple's mind turned to the photograph she had seen in Clara's dressing room, the one now in Craddock's custody. Victor's hand on Clara's shoulder, the tension in her smile. There was a story there, she was certain. "You were close, you say," she ventured. "Did you ever sense any tension? Professional rivalry, perhaps?" Victor's laugh was sharp, almost defensive. "Rivalry, nonsense. We were partners." Miss Marple. Clara's star was rising. "But I've no shortage of opportunities. I've had offers from the West End, even Hollywood." He straightened, his charm reasserting itself. "Her success didn't threaten me. If anything, it raised the play's profile, which helped us all." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite interest. "Of course. And yet, It's curious how success can stir such complex feelings. In my village, I've seen it often, a young man say outshone by another, and the bitterness that follows. She thought of Tommy Pierce, whose jealousy over a rival's promotion had led to a petty theft. Victor's eyes flickered, but he held her gaze. I'm not some village lad, Miss Marple. I'm a professional. Clara's death is a tragedy, but I had nothing to do with it. He glanced at Craddock, who had been silent, his notebook open. I've told you where I was, Inspector. Ask the fans, they'll confirm it. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. We're checking with the stage. Door crowd. A few mentioned you, but no one's pinned down the exact time you left. Victor's smile faltered, just for a moment. It was a mob out there. Hard to keep track of time when you're signing programs and dodging cameras. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her hands folding neatly in her lap. One last thing, Mr. Lane, she said. That scratch on your wrist, however, did you get it? Victor's hand moved instinctively to his cuff, covering the mark. A silly accident. Caught it on a prop during the performance. Sword, I think, in the second act. Barely noticed it. His smile was back, but it didn't reach his eyes. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Props can be so unpredictable, she said, rising. Thank you, Mr. Lane. You've been most forthcoming. She turned to Craddock, who led her out, closing the door behind them. In the corridor, Craddock raised an eyebrow. What do you make of him? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A charming man, Inspector, but charm is such a slippery thing. Like the polish on my vicar's lectern, beautiful, but it hides the wear beneath. She thought of the scratch, the quick denial, the way. Victor's eyes had darted when pressed. He was in Clara's orbit, and stars, you know, can cast long shadows. We must check his story with those fans and that prop sword, too. Craddock nodded, scribbling in his notebook. I'll have my men look into it. The sword's part of the play, but I don't recall any scene where it could have scratched him like that. They walked toward the stage, where a group of stagehands was dismantling a set under the watchful eye of a constable. Miss Marple paused, her gaze sweeping the vast emptiness of the auditorium. Mr. Lane is a performer, she said softly, and performers are skilled at playing parts. But that scratch, it tells a different story, I think. One he's not ready to share. She thought of Clara, her distracted glances during the interval, her expectation of a visitor. Had Victor been that visitor, or had he seen who was? The photograph nagged at her again, the possessive hand, the strained smile. In St. Mary Mead, such small signs had often led to great revelations, and Miss Marple suspected the Marlow Theatre was no different. Shall we speak to Miss Harper next? She asked, her voice light, but her mind already weaving the next thread in the pattern. Chapter 5. The agent's calculations. The drizzle had lifted by midday, leaving London's West End bathed in a pale, watery light that did little to lift the gloom surrounding the Marlow Theatre. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp chill, made her way to a sleek office building on Shaftesbury Avenue, where Evelyn Harper, Clara Vane's agent, conducted her business. The office, perched on the third floor, was a stark contrast to the theatre's faded grandeur, modern affair, of glass and steel, with a reception desk manned by a brisk young woman who eyed Miss Marple's sensible coat and hat with faint curiosity. Inspector Craddock, trailing behind, flashed his badge, and they were ushered into Evelyn's domain. The agent's office was a study in efficiency. A polished mahogany desk held a telephone, a typewriter, and a stack of contracts neatly arranged, in folders. A window offered a view of the bustling avenue below, where theatregoers and delivery boys jostled in equal measure. Evelyn Harper herself stood by a filing cabinet, her dark hair pinned in a severe bun, her tailored suit as sharp as her reputation. She was a woman in her late 30s, with a face that might have been pretty if not for the hard lines of calculation etched around her mouth. "Inspector Craddock," she greeted, her voice crisp, and her gaze settled on Miss Marple, assessing her as one might a minor player in a high-stakes game. "Miss Marple." The elderly lady introduced herself, settling into a chair with a serene smile. "I'm assisting the inspector with inquiries. You were Clara Vane's agent, I understand." Evelyn nodded, taking her seat behind the desk. "I was. Clara was my client. My most promising client, in fact. Her death is a terrible loss." Her tone was measured, but Miss Marple noted the absence of warmth, as if Clara's passing were a ledger entry rather than a tragedy. "I'm sure," Miss Marple said, her knitting needles emerging from her bag with their familiar click. "You must have known her well, managing her career. She was quite the rising star." Evelyn's lips curved in a tight smile. "Clara was a phenomenon. I signed her 2 years ago after Lionel Drake sent her my way. She had raw talent, but no discipline. I shaped her, booked her auditions, negotiated her contracts, handled the press. A Star Ascends was her breakthrough, and mine." She leaned back, her fingers tapping the desk. "I had plans for horror films, international tours. She was my ticket to the top." Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. "A great responsibility," she said softly, "to guide such a young woman. And a great reward, I imagine, for your efforts." She thought of Mrs. Crabbe, the St. Mary Mead seamstress, whose knack for spotting profitable clients was matched only by her sharp tongue. "Where were you last night, Miss Harper, when Clara was taken from us?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "In this office, on the telephone with a producer in New York. We were discussing a film deal for Clara. Big money, big names. I was here until well after the curtain fell, then I went home. My secretary can confirm it." She gestured to a notepad by the telephone, its pages filled with meticulous notes. "I've no reason to harm Clara. She was my golden goose." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze drifting to the stack of contracts on the desk. One folder, slightly askew, bore Clara's name. Another, partially visible, was labeled Victor Lane. "You represent Mr. Lane as well?" she asked, her tone as innocent as a village gossip's. Evelyn's fingers stilled. "Yes, Victor's one of mine. A solid talent, but not in Clara's league. He's been with me longer, though loyal, dependable. He's got a new project lined up, a supporting role in a West End revival." Her voice was brisk, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in her eyes, as if the mention of Victor had stirred something. "How fortunate," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking steadily. "It must be a challenge, balancing the needs of two such ambitious clients. Did they ever clash, Clara and Victor?" Evelyn shrugged, a calculated gesture. "Not that I saw. They were professionals, Miss Marple. Theatre's a competitive world, but they knew their roles. Clara was the star, Victor the foil. He understood that." She leaned forward, her voice firm. "If you're looking for motive, you're barking up the wrong tree. My job was to keep them both shining, not to pit them against each other." Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. "Of course, and yet, in my experience, ambition can stir such delicate tensions. In my village, I recall a young woman, Miss Lucy, who ran the post office. She was devoted to her work, but when a rival took her place, there was quite a stir. She paused, her eyes meeting Evelyn's. Did Clara ever mention any concerns? A disagreement, perhaps, or an unexpected visitor? Evelyn's expression remained composed, but her fingers tightened around a pen. Clara was always fretting. About something: lines, costumes, reviews. Last night, she called me during the interval, said she needed to talk about her contract. I told her to focus on the performance, and we'd meet today. That was the last I heard from her. She hesitated, then added, she did sound agitated, but I put it down to nerves. Opening nights are brutal. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the detail. A call during the interval, another thread to tug. And you didn't visit the theatre after the show? She asked. No, Evelyn said firmly. I was here, as I said. The producer kept me on the line until nearly 11. You can check the call records. She gestured to the telephone, its black surface gleaming under the office light. Craddock, who had been silent, scribbled a note. We will, he said. Your secretary's statement matches, but we're verifying the timeline. The theatre's not far. Someone could slip out and back in a matter of minutes. Evelyn's eyes flashed, but her voice remained cool. I had no reason to slip anywhere, Inspector. Clara's success was my success. Her death is a disaster for my business. She stood, smoothing her skirt. If there's nothing else, I have clients to manage. This tragedy won't stop the industry. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. Thank you, Miss Harper. You've been most helpful. She paused at the door, her gaze lingering on the contracts. One last thing: did Clara ever mention any dissatisfaction with her role in the play or with those around her? Evelyn hesitated, her hand on the doorframe. She was restless, I'll admit. Kept talking about bigger things, Hollywood, mostly. She thought a star ascends was a stepping stone, not a destination. I told her to be patient, but Clara, she wanted everything, and she wanted it now. Her voice held a trace of bitterness, quickly masked. That's all I know. As they left the office, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, weaving the threads of Evelyn's story. The agent's cool pragmatism reminded her of Mrs. Elton, the village shopkeeper, who could tally a ledger with one hand and gossip with the other. A practical woman, she said to Craddock as they descended the stairs. But practicality can hide so much, don't you think? Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. She's got motive. If Clara was planning to jump ship to another agent, those film deals, big money, big prestige. Losing Clara could have cost her dearly. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling faintly. And yet, she spoke of Victor, too. A loyal client, she said, but perhaps one who felt overshadowed. We must look at those contracts, Inspector. They may tell us more than Miss Harper intends. She thought of the photograph again, the tension between Clara and Victor, and now this call during the interval. Clara was expecting someone, she murmured, almost to herself. Someone who mattered enough to unsettle her. They stepped onto Shaftesbury Avenue, where the city's pulse thrummed with life. Miss Marple pulled her coat tighter against the chill, her mind turning over the fragments. Evelyn's calculated calm, the contracts, the late-night call. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how ambition could twist even the most practical hearts. And she suspected that Evelyn Harper, like the others, held secrets yet to be uncovered. To Mr. Moreau, next, Inspector. she asked, her voice light but her thoughts as sharp as her knitting needles. Chapter 6. The stylist's flurry. Afternoon light filtered through the grimy windows of the Marlowe Theatre's costume workshop, casting a soft glow on racks of shimmering gowns and feathered headdresses. Miss Jane Marple, accompanied by Inspector Craddock, stepped into the cramped, chaotic space where Felix Moreau, Clara Vane's stylist, held court. The air was thick with the scent of lavender sachets and steaming fabric, and the hum of a sewing machine punctuated the stillness. Bolts of silk and velvet spilled from shelves, and a mannequin in the corner wore a half-finished costume, pinned with meticulous care. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp as ever, took in the scene, noting the artistry and the obsession that defined this world. Felix Moreau emerged from behind a rack, a whirlwind of energy in a tailored waistcoat and a silk scarf knotted loosely at his throat. His dark hair was artfully tousled, and his hands fluttered like birds as he greeted them, Inspector, and his gaze fell on Miss Marple, and his expressive eyes widened, as if trying to place her in his carefully curated universe. "You are here about ma chère Clara Nan." His French accent was pronounced, though Miss Marple, with her ear for nuance, detected a hint of affectation. "Miss Marple," she introduced herself, settling onto a stool beside a work table strewn with thread and sequins. "I'm assisting the inspector with inquiries. You are Clara Vane's stylist, I believe." Felix's face crumpled, and he pressed a hand to his chest. "Her stylist? Oh, mademoiselle, I was her artist, her confidant. Clara was my canvas, my muse." He gestured to a sketch on the wall, a delicate pencil drawing of Clara in a flowing gown, her auburn curls cascading over her shoulders. "Every costume I designed for her was a masterpiece, crafted to make her shine." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles appearing with their familiar click. "A great gift to bring such beauty to life," she said gently. "You must have been very close to her." She thought of Miss Pollitt, the village milliner, whose devotion to her creations sometimes bordered on possessiveness. Felix sank onto a stool opposite, his eyes glistening. "Close, oh oui. Clara trusted me. She would sit here, in this very room, and we would talk about the play, her dreams, her fears. She was radiant, but so fragile, you know." He dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief, its edge embroidered. With his initials, Miss Marple's needles moved steadily, her gaze fixed on Felix. "And last night," she said, "where were you when the performance ended?" Felix sighed, his hands fluttering again. "Backstage, steaming costumes for today's show. The theatre is chaos after a performance, but I am always working, always preparing. Clara's gowns, they required perfection." He pointed to a steamer in the corner, its hose coiled like a snake. "I was here until the police came, calling us all to that dreadful scene." Craddock, standing near the door, flipped open his notebook. "Anyone see you here, Mr. Moreau? It's a busy time, as you say." Felix's eyes flicked to Craddock, a touch of indignation in his voice. "Mais oui. The wardrobe assistant, Miss Jenny, she was with me. And Tommy Gibbs, the stagehand he passed through, fetching props. Ask them." He leaned forward, his tone earnest. "I would never harm Clara. She was my star, my inspiration." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a mannequin in the corner, draped with a crimson silk scarf identical to the one found around Clara's throat. "That scarf," she said softly, "it's one of your designs, is it not?" Felix followed her gaze, his face pulling. "Oui, it is mine. For the play, Clara wore it in the second act, a a symbol of her character's passion. But there are many such scarves, mademoiselle. The costume department is full of them. He stood, retrieving the scarf and holding it out as if to prove its innocence. This one is clean, untouched. The one that killed her, it was. Not mine. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. Of course. And yet, it's curious, isn't it, how such a beautiful thing can become so deadly. She thought of Mrs. Ellis, the St. Mary Mead florist, whose prize roses had once concealed a spiteful act. Did Clara seem herself last night? Any sign of distress? Felix hesitated, his fingers twisting the scarf. She was not herself, perhaps. During the interval, she came here to change her costume. She was quiet, distracted. I asked if something was wrong, but she only smiled and said, "Felix, you worry too much." Then she left for the stage. His voice broke. I never saw her again. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind catching on the word distracted. Clara's unease, noted by Victor and now Felix, was a thread that ran through the evening. Did she mention expecting anyone? She asked a visitor. Perhaps. Felix shook his head, but his eyes darted to the sketch on the wall, as if seeking Clara's guidance. No, nothing like that. But she did take a telephone call, here in the workshop. I couldn't hear much, only that she sounded sharp, almost angry. I thought it was her agent, Miss Harper, about some contract nonsense. He shrugged, his flair returning. Clara was always juggling demands. Craddock made a note. We'll check the theatre's call log. Any idea what time this was? During the interval, just before the second act, Felix replied, around 9 perhaps. I was too busy to watch the clock. He gestured to the steamer, as if it could vouch for his diligence. Miss Marple's gaze returned to the scarf, its crimson folds catching the light. You designed all of Clara's costumes. She said, you must have known her tastes, her habits. Did she ever speak of tensions? With Mr. Lane, perhaps, or Mr. Drake? Felix's lips pursed, and he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Clara was adored, but not by all. Victor Rowe, he smiled for her, but I saw his eyes when she took her bows. They were cold, mademoiselle, like a snake's. And Mr. Drake, he treated her like his doll, always pushing, always demanding. She told me once he frightened her with his intensity. He paused, then added, Miss Harper Tucci was always calling, always planning. Clara felt trapped sometimes. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving Felix's words into the pattern. His grief seemed genuine, but his flair for drama made her wary. She recalled Mr. Pym, the village grocer, whose theatrical tales often hid half-truths. And you, Mr. Moreau. She said gently, how did you feel about Clara's plans to leave the play? For films, perhaps? Felix's eyes widened, and he clutched the scarf tighter. Leave? Oh. She spoke of it, but I never believed she would go. She belonged here, on the stage, in my costumes. Hollywood is vulgar. Mademoiselle would have dulled her light. His voice trembled, but Miss Marple noted the possessiveness in his tone, like a painter unwilling to part with his masterpiece. She folded her knitting, tucking it into her bag. Thank you, Mr. Moreau. You've painted a vivid picture. She rose, her small frame dwarfed by the racks of costumes. One last thing, did you notice anything unusual in Clara's dressing room last night? A misplaced item, perhaps? Felix frowned, his brow furrowing. I wasn't in her room after the show, but during the interval, when I brought her the scarf for the second act, there was a note on her vanity, folded with her name on it. I didn't read it, mon dear. I'm no snoop, but she tucked it away quickly when she saw me. He shrugged. Probably a fan letter. She got many. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Probably, she said, but her mind was already turning over the note's significance. A folded note, a distracted star, an angry phone call new. Threads in the tapestry. She thanked Felix and followed Craddock out, pausing to glance back at the workshop. The mannequin's scarf seemed to watch her, a silent witness to the drama. In the corridor, Craddock flipped through his notebook. What do you make of him, Miss Marple? All that weeping and waving genuine, or a performance? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A bit of both, I think, Inspector. Mr. Moreau loved Clara, or at least the idea of her. But love can be a jealous thing, and jealousy, well, it can twist even the most artistic soul. She thought of the note, the scarf, the phone call. We must find that note if it still exists, and the call logged Clara's conversation may tell us who she was expecting. Craddock nodded, his expression grim. I'll have my men search her dressing room again, and we'll talk to Jenny and Tommy Gibbs about Moreau's alibi. As they stepped into the theatre's foyer, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to St. Mary Mead, where a village fate had once revealed a hidden grudge in a single glance. Felix's flair was dazzling, but beneath it she sensed a heart that clung too tightly to its muse. The stagehands next, Inspector, she asked, her voice light but her mind as sharp as ever, ready to unravel the next thread in Clara Vane's tragedy. Chapter 7. Whispers in the wings. The Marlowe Theatre, though closed to the public, hummed with a subdued energy as Miss Jane Marple and Inspector Craddock moved through its backstage labyrinth. The afternoon had deepened, and the corridors, lined with ropes and pulleys, seemed to pulse with the echoes of last night's tragedy. Stagehands and crew members, their faces drawn with shock and suspicion, worked quietly under police supervision, dismantling sets and cataloguing props. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked with a purposeful calm, her eyes darting to the shadows where secrets often lingered. She had seen such places before, not in grand theatres, but in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead, where whispers in the church hall or behind the grocer's counter could unravel a mystery. Craddock led her to a small break room near the stage, where a group of stagehands and chorus girls had gathered, their voices low and their glances wary. The room was cluttered with folding chairs, a battered kettle, and a table strewn with dog-eared magazines and empty tea mugs. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and sawdust, and a single bulb cast harsh light on the tired faces of the theatres. Unsung workers. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar click, and smiled at the assembled group. I do hope you'll forgive the intrusion, she said, her voice gentle. I'm merely trying to understand what happened to poor Miss Vane. A young stagehand, Tommy Gibbs, shifted uncomfortably, his cap twisted in his hands. It's awful, miss, he said. Clara was, well, she was kind, always said hello, even to us lot. His eyes darted to Craddock, who stood by the door, notebook in hand. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. I'm sure she was. You found her, didn't you, Mr. Gibbs? That must have been a terrible shock. Tommy swallowed, his freckled face spalling. Aye, it was. I was fetching a proper candlestick for the next show when I saw her door open. Thought I'd check, you know, in case she needed something. Then I saw her, slumped at her vanity, that scarf round her neck. He shuddered, his voice trailing off, and you saw no one else nearby. Miss Marple asked, her needles moving steadily. She thought of young Billy in St. Mary Mead, whose nervous stammer had once betrayed a hidden truth. Tommy hesitated, glancing at the others. It was busy, Miss people running about, like always after a show. I think I saw Mr. Lane near the corridor earlier, maybe before the last act. He was pacing, looked, I dunno, cross. But I can't be sure of the time. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Pacing, you say? How interesting. She turned to a wardrobe assistant, a slight girl with mousy hair named Jenny, who clutched a cup of tea as if it were a lifeline. And you, my dear, you were with Mr. Moreau last night. I believe. Jenny nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am. I was helping Felix Mr. Morestein costumes in the workshop. He was fussing over a gown for Clara, said it had to be perfect for today. She paused, her fingers tightening. Around the cup. I did see him with a scarf, one like the one, you know. He was holding it, muttering about Clara, changing her mind about the costume at the last minute. Miss Marple's needles paused, just for a moment. Changing her mind, did she often do that? Jenny shrugged, her eyes flickering to the others. Sometimes, Clara was particular about her look. Said the scarf didn't feel right for the second act, wanted something plainer. Felix was put out, he'd designed it special for her. Craddock jotted a note, his brow furrowing. And you're sure Mr. Moreau was with you the whole time after the show? Jenny hesitated, her cheeks flushing. Mostly, he stepped out. For a bit said he needed to check something in the prop room. Wasn't gone long 10 minutes, maybe. She looked down, as if regretting her words. Miss Marple smiled reassuringly, thinking of Mrs. Baker, the village baker's wife, whose vague recollections often held vital clues. 10 minutes can be quite enough, my dear, she said softly. Did anyone else come to the workshop during the interval? Jenny frowned, thinking. Clara did, to change. And I think Miss Harper was in the corridor, on her telephone. I heard her voice, sharp like, talking to someone. Didn't see her, though. Miss Marple's mind caught on this new thread. Evelyn Harper, pacing the corridor, on a call perhaps the one Felix had overheard Clara take. She turned to an older stagehand, a grizzled man named Bert, who leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. And you, sir, did you notice anything unusual last night? Bert scratched his stubbled chin, his eyes narrowing. Heard Mr. Drake and Clara having a bit of a row before the show. In her dressing room. It was... He was on about her wanting to leave the play, said it'd ruin everything. She told him to back off, said she'd made up her mind. He shrugged. Didn't think much of it, directors and actors, always squabbling. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. A row with Drake, a distracted Clara, a scarf that didn't feel right. She recalled Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, whose sharp ears had once caught a whispered confession at a fete. And after the show, she asked, "Did you see any of our persons of interest near Clara's dressing room?" Bert grunted. Saw Miss Harper heading that way, just after the curtain. Looked in a hurry, clutching her clipboard like it was her lifeline. And Mr. Lane, he was lingering near the stage door, but I swear I saw him slip down the corridor toward the dressing rooms before the fans mobbed him. Craddock's pen moved swiftly, capturing the details. That's 2 sightings of Lane near the dressing room, he muttered. And Harper, too. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her mind weaving the fragments into a pattern. "And Mr. Moreau?" she asked, her voice mild. "Did anyone see him outside the workshop?" A chorus girl, a bright-eyed young woman named Lily, spoke up, her voice hesitant. "I saw Felix near the prop room, after the show. He was carrying a bundle of fabric scarves, I think. Said he was sorting costumes, but he looked flustered, not like his usual self." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Flustered," she murmured. How very telling, she thought, of Mr. Ellis, the florist, whose nervous fidgeting had once betrayed a guilty conscience. She turned to the group, her smile warm. "You've all been so helpful. It's the little things, you know, the glances, the whispers that, so often, show us the way." As they left the break room, Craddock flipped through his notes. "That's more than we had before," he said. Lane near the dressing room, Harper in the corridor, Moreau stepping out, and Drake's argument sounds like Clara was stepping. On toes, Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. Clara was a star, inspector, and stars cast long shadows. Each of these people wanted something from her control, glory, loyalty, but someone wanted her gone. She paused, her gaze lingering on a stage door, slightly ajar, leading to the alley outside. That note Felix mentioned, in Clara's dressing room, we must find it, and the call log, to confirm who she spoke to. Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "I've got men searching her room again, and we'll pull the theatre's telephone records. If that call was to Harper or someone else, it could point us in the right direction." Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to St. Mary Mead, where a whispered conversation at the village shop had once unravelled a theft. The theatre was grander, but its whispers were no less revealing. "We're close, Inspector," she said softly. "The truth is in these small moments, the pacing, the scarf, the note. We need only follow them." They stepped into the foyer, where the chandelier dim glow casts long shadows. Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of clues, each thread carefully placed. Victor's scratch, Evelyn's call, Felix's absence, Drake's argument. She knew the pattern was forming, but one piece remained elusive. "Shall we review the evidence?" In Clara's dressing room again, she asked, her voice light but her resolve as firm as ever. Chapter 8. The Motive Unravelled. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy curtains of Miss Jane Marple's room at the Langham Hotel, casting a soft glow on the floral wallpaper and the small table where she sat, her knitting spread before her. The clink of a teacup against its saucer punctuated the quiet, and the faint hum of London's traffic drifted up from the street below. Miss Marple's hands moved with their usual precision, her needles weaving a delicate lace pattern, but her mind was far from the yarn. It danced across the fragments of Clara Vane's murder, piecing together the threads she had gathered from Lionel Drake's ambition, Victor Lane's charm, Evelyn Harper's calculations, Felix Moreau's flair, and the whispers of the stagehands. Each suspect had a story, and each story held a shadow of motive. But the truth, she knew, lay in the spaces between their words. She set her knitting aside and opened her notebook, a small leather-bound volume where she jotted observations in her neat, spidery script. The photograph from Clara's dressing room, delivered by Inspector Craddock that morning, lay beside it. Clara and Victor, arm in arm, smiled for the camera, but Miss Marple's keen eyes lingered on the details. Clara's smile, tight at the edges, and Victor's hand, gripping her shoulder with a firmness that spoke of possession rather than affection. She thought of young Mary in St. Mary Mead, whose forced smile at a village dance had hinted at a lover's quarrel. The photograph was a clue, not to love, but to envy, poison she had seen fester in many a heart. Her thoughts turned to the suspects. Lionel Drake, the director, had staked his reputation on A Star Ascends. His passion for the play was palpable, but so was his need for control. Clara's refusal to extend the run, her talk of Hollywood, had threatened his vision. Would he kill to protect his legacy? Miss Marple recalled Mr. Clements, the village baker, whose obsession with his shop's success had driven him to desperate acts. Drake's alibi, the lighting booth, was supported by his assistant, but the assistant's nervous contradictions suggested gaps, moments when Drake could have slipped away. Evelyn Harper, the agent, was another puzzle. Her cool pragmatism masked a fierce ambition, and Clara's success was her ticket to the top. Yet the contracts on her desk hinted at other clients, like Victor, who might benefit from Clara's absence. Evelyn's claim of a late-night call to a producer was verifiable, but the theatre was close enough for a quick visit. And that phone call Clara made during the interval, had it been to Evelyn, as Felix suggested? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Elton, the shopkeeper, whose ledgers hid more than financial secrets. Evelyn's loyalty to Clara was financial, not personal, and money, she knew, could twist the heart as surely as love. Felix Moreau, the stylist, was a study in devotion. His tears for Clara seemed genuine, but his possessiveness, his talk of her as his canvas, echoed the obsession of Miss Pollitt, the milliner, who once sabotaged a rival's hat out of spite. Felix's alibi, steaming costumes, was weakened by Jenny's admission that he had left the workshop for 10 minutes, and the scarf, his own design, linked him to the crime, though he claimed dozens existed. His flustered demeanor, noted by the chorus girl Lily, suggested something amiss. Had he confronted Clara only to lose control? Victor Lane, however, stood out most sharply. His charm was a polished mask, but the scratch on his wrist, his presence near Clara's dressing room, and his quick denial of rivalry all pointed to a deeper truth. The stagehands had seen him pacing, perhaps angry, before the final act, and again near the dressing room after the curtain fell. His claim of signing autographs was plausible, but the lack of precise timing left room for doubt. Miss Marple thought of Tommy Pierce, the village lad whose jealousy over a rival's success had led to a reckless act. Victor's envy of Clara's rising fame was a motive as old as the stage itself, and the photograph's tension suggested a personal grudge. She sipped her tea, her mind turning to the note Felix had seen in Clara's dressing room, folded with her name on it. It had not been found in the police search, which suggested the killer had taken a tour. Clara had hidden it. The phone call, too, was critical. If it was to Evelyn, as Felix thought, it might reveal Clara's agitation, her plans to leave. But if it was to someone else, Victor, perhaps, or even an unknown party, it could shift the pattern entirely. Miss Marple's fingers traced the edge of the photograph, her thoughts circling the moment of Clara's death. No struggle, Craddock had said, which meant she knew her killer. Trusted them enough to let them close. A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Inspector Craddock entered, his face weary but alert. "Miss Marple," he greeted, settling into a chair with a sigh. "We've got the call log from the theatre." Clara made one outgoing call during the interval at 9:05 to Evelyn Harper's office. It lasted 3 minutes. Harper confirms it was about a contract, but she's vague on the details. Says Clara was pushing for changes. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Changes, you say? How interesting." And the note Felix mentioned? Craddock shook his head. No sign of it. We've torn the dressing room apart, nothing but scripts, cosmetics, and that photograph. If there was a note, either the killer took it or Clara hid it well. Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the new information into the tapestry. A 3-minute call, and Clara was agitated. According to Felix, perhaps she was confronting Miss Harper or someone else entirely. She tapped the photograph. This image, Inspectorate, tells a story. Victor's hold on Clara, her strained smile. I wonder if he felt her slipping away, stealing the light he craved. Craddock leaned forward, his notebook open. You're leaning toward Lane, then. He's got the weakest alibi. The stagehands place him near the dressing room, and that scratch he's sticking to the prop's sword story. But we checked the sword. It's blunt, no sharp edges. Couldn't have made that mark. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. A lie, however small, is like a dropped stitch, it unravels the whole. Victor's charm is his shield, but it's cracking. She paused, her thoughts drifting to the scarf. And yet, we mustn't overlook the others. Mr. Drake's control, Miss Harper's contracts, Mr. Morrow's obsession, they all have their shadows. We need more, Inspector. The note, if it exists, could be the key. Craddock nodded, flipping through his notes. We're re-interviewing the stagehands and checking the prop room for any trace of that bundle of scarves. Lily saw Felix, carrying, and we've got a constable talking to the fans at the stage door to pin down Lane's timeline. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her gaze distant. Good, and perhaps a visit to the theatre again, to walk those corridors. The answer lies there, in the moments we haven't yet seen. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a forgotten letter in a church pew had once solved a mystery. Clara was expecting someone, Inspector. That note, that called a point to a meeting, one she didn't expect to end in death. Craddock rose, his expression resolute. I'll arrange for us to go back tonight, and I'll have Harper's call records double-checked. If she's hiding something, we'll find it. Miss Marple smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. The truth is patient, Inspector. It waits for us to notice it. As Craddock left, she returned to her notebook, jotting a single word, envy. It was the thread that tied Victor most tightly to the crime. But she knew better than to pull it too soon. The pattern was nearly complete, but one twist remained, hidden in the wings of the Marlowe Theatre. Chapter 9. A Trap Set. The Marlowe Theatre, shrouded in the early evening gloom, stood like a silent sentinel as Miss Jane, Marple, and Inspector Craddock approached its stage door. The drizzle had returned, casting a fine mist over the West End, and the theatre's marquee, unlit, bore a mournful air. Inside, the corridors were dimly lit, the usual bustle replaced by an eerie quiet broken only by the distant clatter of a constable's boots. Miss Marple, her umbrella tucked under one arm, moved with her customary calm, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for the smallest clue. She had suggested to Craddock that they gathered the suspects Lionel Drake, Victor Lane, Evelyn Harper, and Felix Morove for a reconstruction of the fatal evening, a tactic she had used before in St. Mary Mead to coax truth from guarded hearts. The auditorium, vast and empty, echoed with the ghosts of applause as they entered. The stage, stripped of its set, was a bare expanse of wood, its curtains drawn back to reveal the stark machinery of the theatre. Craddock had arranged for the 4 suspects to meet them here, under the pretense of clarifying their movements. On the night of Clara Vane's murder, Miss Marple settled into a front row seat, her knitting bag at her side, and surveyed the scene. The chandelier above cast a muted glow, and the air held the faint tint of grease paint and dust. She thought of the village hall, where a carefully staged meeting had once unravelled a theft, and hoped this grander stage would yield similar results. Lionel Drake arrived first, his wiry frame tense, his eyes darting to the empty seats as if expecting an audience. "This is absurd," he muttered, adjusting his scarf with a theatrical flourish. "I've told you everything, Inspector. Must we play this charade?" Victor Lane followed, his charm undimmed despite the hour. He flashed a smile at Miss Marple, but she noted the tightness around his eyes, the way his hand strayed to his wrist, where the scratch was now faintly scabbed. Evelyn Harper entered next, her clipboard clutched like a shield, her expression one of controlled impatience. Felix Moreau swept in last, a silk handkerchief fluttering in his hand, his face pale but his flair intact. "Mon Dieu," he murmured, glancing at the stage. "This place, it feels so empty without Clara." Craddock stood at the foot of the stage, his notebook open. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice firm. "We're here to go over your movements on the night Miss Vane died. Sometimes, revisiting the scene jogs the memory. Miss Marple, if you'd start." Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding the room despite its modesty. "It's the little details that matter," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "Clara was killed in her dressing room, with a scar from the play, between the final curtain and the discovery of her body. Each of you was near that corridor at some point. Let us begin with you, Mr. Drake." Drake stiffened, his hands clenching. "I've said it before, I was in the lighting booth with Hargreaves until the curtain fell. Then I went to my office to review notes. I didn't go near Clara's dressing room." His voice was sharp, but Miss Marple noted his quick glance toward the wings as if tracing his path. She nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her seat. "And you, Mr. Lane?" Victor leaned against a seat, his posture relaxed but his eyes wary. Stage door, signing autographs. The fans were relentless, dozens of them. "I was nowhere near Clara's room after the show." He smiled, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of his hand, brushing his wrist. Evelyn Harper spoke next, her voice crisp. "I was in my office, on the telephone with a producer. I didn't leave until 11. Clara called me during the interval about her contract, but I didn't see her after that." Her fingers tightened on her clipboard, and Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in them. Felix dabbed his eyes with his handkerchief, his voice trembling. "I was in the workshop, steaming costumes with Jenny. I stepped out briefly to the prop room, but I didn't go to Clara's dressing room. She was my muse. Why would I harm her?" His gaze darted to the stage, where a single spotlight flickered. As if mourning Clara's absence, Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Thank you all," she said, "but let us consider the scene itself. Clara was found at her vanity, no struggle, no outcry. She knew her killer, trusted them enough to let them close." She turned to Craddock, who nodded and signalled a constable. The constable, a young man named Harris, emerged from the wings, carrying a small evidence bag. "We found this in the dressing room, tucked inside a script," he said, holding up a folded note. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was the note Felix had mentioned, overlooked in the initial search. Craddock opened it, his brow furrowing, as he read aloud, "Meet me after the show. We need to talk. V." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Victor's face paled, his charm faltering. "That's not mine," he said quickly. "Anyone could have written it. V could be anyone. Miss Marple tilted her head, her voice soft. Could it, Mr. Lane? The stagehands saw you near. Clara's dressing room, not at the stage door, as you claimed. And that scratch on your wrist, it's not from a prop sword, is it? She thought of Tommy Pierce in St. Mary Mead, whose lies had crumbled under gentle pressure. Victor's eyes darted to the others, his smile gone. I told you, it was an accident, and I was at the stage, Durask the fans. Craddock stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We did. 2 fans recall you signing programs, but they say you left early, before 10. Clara was found at 10:15. Evelyn Harper's lips tightened, and she glanced at Victor, her expression unreadable. If you're accusing him, Inspector, you'd better have proof. That note could mean anything. Miss Marple turned to Felix, her gaze steady. Mr. Moreau, you saw this note in Clara's dressing room during the interval. Did she say anything about it? Felix hesitated, his handkerchief twisting in his hands. She tucked it away, as if it were private. I thought it was a fan, or perhaps Mr. Drake, but now, his eyes flicked to Victor, wide with realization. Drake's voice cut through. The tension? This is preposterous. I was nowhere near her room, and I didn't write any note. You're wasting time while the real killer slips away. Miss Marple's needles clicked on, her voice unruffled. The real killer, Mr. Drake, is closer than you think. Clara was expecting someone she trusted. That note, that scarf, they point to a moment of betrayal. She turned to Evelyn. Miss Harper, you spoke to Clara during the interval. Was it about this note, perhaps? Evelyn's eyes narrowed. She called about her contract. As I said, she was upset, wanted to renegotiate her terms. I told her to wait until after the show, that's all. Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers gripped the clipboard, white-knuckled. Held up the note. We'll have this analyzed for fingerprints, but it's a start. And we've confirmed Miss Harper's call to the producer ended at 10:50, leaving a window for a visit to the theatre. Mr. Moreau, Jenny says you were gone from the workshop for at least 10 minutes, san of time to reach Clara's room. Felix gasped, his hand flying to his chest. You cannot think I would hurt her. She was my star, my creation. His voice broke, but Miss Marple saw the calculation in his eyes, the same she had seen in Mr. Pym, the grocer, when cornered. She rose, her small figure commanding the room. Clara's death was no accident, she said softly. It was born of envy, of a heart that couldn't bear her light. We are close, Inspector, to seeing that heart laid bare. Her eyes lingered on Victor, whose face was now a mask of unease, and she knew the trap was tightening. As Craddock dismissed the suspects, Miss Marple's mind raced, weaving the note, the scratch, the alibis into a pattern. In St. Mary Mead, a single glance had once revealed a murderer, and here, in the Marlowe's shadowed wings, the truth was beginning to take shape. Tomorrow, Inspector, she said, her voice low, we must press harder. The killer is among us, and they are growing restless. Chapter 10. The co-star's confession, the Marlowe Theatre, bathed in the pale light of a foggy London morning, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Jane Marple and Inspector Craddock returned to its hallowed halls. The reconstruction the previous evening had stirred the suspects, their guarded faces betraying cracks in their carefully crafted stories. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, walked with a quiet determination, her mind a tapestry of clues woven from the past day's inquiries. The note signed V, the crimson scarf, Victor Lane's scratch. and Clara Vane's distracted demeanour all pointed to a truth she felt was now within reach. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen how a single misstep could unravel a lie, and she sensed that Victor, with his polished charm and faltering alibi, was teetering on the edge of such a misstep. Craddock had arranged for the suspects to gather once more, this time in the theatre's green room. A cosy space cluttered with worn armchairs, a chipped tea urn, and posters of past productions. The air was thick with tension as Lionel Drake, Victor Lane, Evelyn Harper, and Felix Moreau took their seats, their expressions ranging from defiant to wary. Miss Marple settled into a corner chair, her needles clicking softly, her serene demeanour a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere. Craddock stood by a small table, the evidence bag containing the note prominently displayed, its folded edge a silent accusation. "Thank you for coming again," Craddock began, his voice steady. "We've made progress. The note found in Clara's dressing room, signed V, has been analysed. No fingerprints, but the handwriting is distinctive. We've also confirmed Miss Harper's call to her producer ended at 10:50, leaving a window for a visit to the theatre. Mr. Moreau, your absence from the workshop was longer than you claimed, closer to 15 minutes, per Jenny's revised statement. And Mr. Drake, your assistant, now admits you left the lighting booth briefly after the curtain fell to check on the stage." Drake's face reddened. "That's nonsense. I was ensuring the set was clear for the next day. I didn't go near Clara's room." His voice carried the indignation of a man unaccustomed to being questioned, but Miss Marple noted the way his hands clenched, betraying his unease. Evelyn Harper's eyes narrowed, her clipboard resting on her lap. "This is a waste of time. Inspector, I was on the phone, as I've said. Check the records again, if you must." Her tone was sharp, but Miss Marple saw the slight tremble in her fingers, a sign of strain she had seen in Mrs. Elton, the village shopkeeper. When pressed about a discrepancy, Felix Moreau clutched his handkerchief, his eyes wide. 15 minutes. Mon Dieu, Jenny must be mistaken. "I was fetching thread from the prop room, nothing more. Clara was my musae, would never harm her." His voice quavered, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of calculation in his gaze. Reminiscent of Mr. Pym's theatrics in St. Mary Mead. Victor Lane, however, was the focus of her attention. He sat with his arms crossed, his smile strained, the scratch on his wrist now a faint but damning mark. "This is absurd," he said, his voice smooth but edged with tension. "That note could be from anyone, Vera, Violet, some stagehand named Vince. You're grasping at straws, Inspector." Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her eyes meeting Victor's with a gentle but piercing intensity. "Are we, Mr. Lane?" she asked softly. "You were seen near Clara's dressing room, not at the stage door, as you claimed. The fans confirm you left early, before 10. And that scratch hardly the work of a blunt prop sword, is it?" She paused, her voice as calm as a village gossip's. Clara was expecting someone, wasn't she? Someone who wrote that note, asking to meet after the show. Someone she trusted, until the moment that scarf tightened around her throat. Victor's smile faltered, his eyes darting to the note on the table. "You're fishing, Miss Mop. I told you I was with the fans. I didn't write any note, and I didn't see Clara after the show." His voice was firm, but his hand strayed to his wrist, a gesture Miss Marple had seen in young Tommy Pierce when cornered about a theft. She leaned forward, her tone gentle but relentless. "You wanted the lead role, didn't you, Mr. Lane? Clara's. Light was too bright, and you couldn't bear to stand in her shadow. The reviews praised her, the audiences adored her, and you were her foil, always second. She thought of the photograph, the possessive grip, the strained smiles. You went to her dressing room, didn't you? To confront her, perhaps about her plans to leave, to take her stardom to Hollywood. And when she laughed, when she dismissed you, something snapped. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint creak of the theatre's old timbers. Victor's face drained of color, his charm crumbling like a poorly built set. "That's ridiculous," he stammered, but his voice cracked and his eyes flicked to the others, seeking an ally. None came. Craddock stepped closer, his notebook open. "We've got a witness, Mr. Lane. Tommy Gibbs saw you enter Clara's dressing room just after the curtain, not pacing the corridor as you claimed. And that scratch our doctor says it's consistent with a struggle, perhaps from Clara's nails as she fought back." Victor's hands clenched, his breathing uneven. No, you've got it wrong. I didn't." He stopped, his eyes wild, and Miss Marple saw the moment his defenses broke, like a curtain falling on a failed performance. "All right," he burst out, his voice raw. "I went to her room. I wrote the note. I wanted to talk, to convince her to stay with the play. She was going to leave, said she didn't need me, didn't need any of us. She laughed at me, said I'd never be more than a supporting act." His voice trembled with rage, his hands shaking. "I didn't mean to. I grabbed the scarf. It was right there, and I couldn't stop." The room froze, the confession hanging like a spotlight's glare. Felix gasped, his handkerchief pressed to his mouth. Evelyn's clipboard slipped to the floor, her face pale. Drake stared, his indignation replaced by shock. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her heart ached for Clara, snuffed out by a moment of envy. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a jealous glance at a village fate had once led to betrayal. Craddock signaled to the constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Victor Lane, you're under arrest for the murder of Clara Vane," he said, his voice steady. Victor didn't resist, his shoulders slumping as the cuffs clicked shut. His charm extinguished but Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked neatly into her bag. "Jealousy is a cruel master," she said softly, her eyes on Victor. "It blinds us to what we have, and drives us to destroy what we cannot." She turned to Craddock, her voice low. "The note was the key, Inspector. It led us to his heart, and his heart betrayed him." As Victor was led away, the others remained, their faces a mix of relief and unease. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on them, Drake's clenched jaw, Evelyn's guarded eyes, Felix's trembling hands. Each had their secrets, but only Victor's had turned deadly. The theatre, she knew, would carry on, but its light would be dimmer without Clara's star. Chapter 11. The Curtain Falls. The Marlow Theatre. Its grandeur muted by the fog that clung to London streets, stood as a sombre monument to Clara Vane's brief and brilliant life. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manager's office with Inspector Craddock, watched as the morning light filtered through a high window, casting long shadows across the cluttered desk. The air was heavy with the scent of old playbills and ink, and the distant clatter of stagehands preparing for the theatre's reopening echoed faintly. Victor Lane's confession had closed the case, but Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow for the young actress whose light had been extinguished by envy. Her knitting lay untouched in her bag, her hands folded in her lap as she reflected on the tragedy that had unfolded. Craddock, his notebook closed for once, leaned back in his chair, his face weary but relieved. "It's done, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "Lane's in custody. and his confession matches the evidence Army Gibbs's citing, the note, the scratch. The doctor confirmed it was likely from Clara's nails, a desperate mark as she fought back. He'll face trial, and I doubt he'll charm his way out of this one. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant. Poor Clara, she murmured. To be taken so young, and for so petty a reason. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a village lad's jealousy had once led to a broken window, a small act compared to murder, but born of the same dark impulse. Victor wanted her place in the spotlight, but all he's gained is a shadow. Craddock glanced at her, his expression curious. You saw it from the start, didn't you? The way he carried himself, that scratch it was like you knew. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Not knew, Inspector, but suspected. People are so much the same, whether in a village or a theatre. They wear their masks, but the heart betrays them in a glance, a gesture, a lie that doesn't quite fit. She recalled the photograph, Victor's possessive hand on Clara's shoulder, and the note signed V, which had sealed his fate. The note was his undoing, but it was his envy that wrote it. The door opened, and a constable entered, carrying a tray with a teapot and cups. Miss Marple accepted a cup, the warmth soothing her hands as she sipped. And the others? She asked. Mr. Drake, Miss Harper, Mr. Moreau, how do they fare? Craddock poured himself a cup, his movements deliberate. Drake's already planning a memorial performance. Though I suspect it's as much for his own reputation as for Clara. He's shaken, but he's a survivor, already talking about recasting the lead. Harper's back at her office, juggling contracts, cool as ever. She's lost her star, but she's got Victor and others to keep her business afloat. Moreau's a wreck, weeping over his sketches, but he's been offered a job designing for a new production. They'll move on, as theatre folk do. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to the suspects. Lionel Drake's ambition, fierce and unyielding, had not driven him to murder, but his need for control had blinded him to Clara's struggles. Evelyn Harper's calculations, cold and precise, had kept her at a distance, her loyalty tied to profit rather than affection. Felix Moreau's devotion, though genuine, had bordered on obsession, his tears masking a heart that clung too tightly to its muse. Only Victor's envy had crossed the line, turning a moment of rage into a fatal act. She thought of Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, whose quiet observations had once revealed a village betrayal, and saw the same pattern here, writ large on the theatre's stage. It's a sad business, Inspector, she said softly. Clara was their star, their dream, but dreams can turn to nightmares when envy takes hold. She set her teacup down, her gaze settling on a poster of A Star Ascends, Clara's radiant face beaming from the frame. She trusted Victor, you know, let him close enough to betray her. That's the true tragedy, not just her death, but the trust it broke. Craddock nodded, his expression somber. The evidence is Solid Lane's confession, the note, the timeline. We've got statements from the stagehands and fans, and the scarf's fibers match the one from the costume department. It's a closed case, thanks to you. Miss Marple shook her head, her smile gentle. Not me, Inspector. The truth was there, waiting to be seen. I only looked where it pointed. She thought of the village hall, where a misplaced glove had once solved a mystery, and knew that Clara's note, Victor's scratch, and the whispers in the wings had done the same. Will the theatre reopen soon? Tomorrow, Craddock said. Drake's pushing for it, says the show must go on. They're dedicating the performance to Clara, though I suspect the audiences will come for the scandal as much as the art. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. People are drawn to tragedy, aren't they? Like moths to a flame. She rose, smoothing her skirt. I shall return to St. Mary Mead tomorrow, Inspector. London is too grand for me, and my roses need tending. Craddock stood, offering a rare smile. You'll be missed, Miss Marple. If we'd had you from the start, we'd have wrapped this up days ago. She chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling. You're too kind, Inspector. But crime, like gossip, follows its own rhythm. One need only listen. She gathered her knitting bag, her thoughts already turning to the quiet lanes of her village, where the dramas were smaller but no less human. As they left the office, Miss Marple paused in the foyer, her gaze lingering on the chandelier, its crystals dim without the stage lights. The Marlowe Theatre would recover, its curtains would rise again. But Clara's absence would linger, a shadow no spotlight could erase. She thought of the girl's laughter, her distracted glances, her dreams of Hollywood snuffed out by a moment, of malice, and she thought of Victor, whose charm had hidden a heart consumed by envy, now bound for a darker stage. Chapter 12. Reflections in St. Mary Mead. The train to St. Mary Mead rattled gently through the countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the clamour of London now left behind. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting bag nestled. Beside her, the soft greens and golds of the passing fields, a balm after the shadowed drama of the Marlowe Theatre. Her hands, though idle for once, rested lightly on her lap, and her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, gazed not at the scenery, but at the memories of Clara Vane's tragedy. The case was solved, Victor Lane's confession secured, yet the weight of it lingered, like a melody that refused to fade. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair by the fire, the crackle of logs a familiar comfort. The room was a study in coziness, lace curtains at the windows, a vase of late roses on the mantel, and her knitting basket brimming with skeins of wool. She poured a cup of tea from the pot her maid, Cherry, had left, and let her thoughts drift to the Marlowe Theatre, where envy had turned a star's light to darkness. The photograph of Clara and Victor, the crimson scarf, the folded note signed V, each had played its part, but it was the human heart, with its fragile hopes and bitter jealousies, that had written the final act. A knock at the door announced Raymond West, her nephew, his face alight with curiosity. "Aunt Jane," he exclaimed, settling onto the sofa with a flourish. "I've read the papers. Clara Vane's murder, solved by none other than you. You must tell me everything. Was it as thrilling as it sounds?" Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Thrilling, dear? No, I wouldn't say that. Sad, rather. A young life lost, and for what? A moment of envy." She sipped her tea, her thoughts returning to the theatre's gilded halls. Victor Lane was a charming man, Raymond, but charm is a thin veil when the heart is consumed by want. Raymond leaned forward, his writer's instinct piqued. "But how did you know it was him?" "The papers mention a note, a scratch. What was it that tipped you off?" Miss Marple set her cup down, her hands folding neatly in her lap. "It was the pattern, dear. In St. Mary Mead, I've seen it before. Jealousy that festers, a smile that hides resentment. Victor's scratch was no accident. It was Clara's last defiance, a mark of her struggle. And the note, signed with his initial, was his mistake, a plea for a meeting she didn't expect to end in death. She thought of young Tommy Pierce, whose envy of a rival's success had led to a petty crime. and saw the same thread in Victor's fatal act. Raymond's eyes widened. But the others, the director, the agent, the stylist, they all had motives, didn't they? How did you rule them out? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. They had motives, yes, but not the means or the moment. Mr. Drake's ambition was fierce, but he loved his play too much to destroy its star. Miss Harper's calculations were cold, but her future rested on Clara's success, not her death. And Mr. Moreau, his devotion was almost too much, but it was adoration, not malice. She paused, her gaze drifting to the fire. Victor, though, stood in Clara's shadow, and he couldn't bear it. The photograph told me that his hand on her shoulder, her smile strained. It was a story of possession, not partnership. Raymond shook his head, marveling. You see things, Aunt Jane, that the rest of us miss, like something out of one of my novels, but real. Miss Marple chuckled softly. Life is often stranger than novels, Raymond, and sadder, too, she thought. Of Clara, her auburn curls and radiant presence, now just a memory on a poster. She was a girl with dreams, like so many in my village. But dreams can draw envy, and envy can destroy. She rose, moving to the window to adjust the curtains. The garden beyond was quiet, the roses nodding in the evening breeze. The theatre will go on, she said, almost to herself. They always do, but Clara's light is gone, and that is the true loss. She turned back to Raymond, her smile gentle. Now, tell me about your latest book. I trust it's not another murder. Raymond laughed, launching into a spirited description of his work. But Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the Marlow Theatre. The case was closed, the killer caught, but the human heart, with its tangled desires, would always write new dramas. She picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their familiar click, and settled back into her chair, ready for the next puzzle life might bring. Whether in London's grand stages or the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead,